The war chamber deep inside the Jarthic Confederation's command station buzzed with quiet energy as dozens of military officers and council members gathered for what they assumed would be just another routine meeting. Admiral Vector stood at the center of the circular room, his multiple eyes focused on the massive holographic projection that floated before them all. The image showed a small blue and green planet spinning slowly in the darkness of space. This was Earth, and to the Jarthic, it represented nothing more than conquest number 473 in their long history of galactic expansion. The Supreme Council had assembled specifically for this authorization hearing, though most of them had already made up their minds before even arriving. The Jarthic had perfected the art of planetary conquest over 4 centuries, and their track record was flawless. Every world they had targeted eventually fell under their control, some within days, others within months, but all of them eventually surrendered. The council members sat in their elevated seats around the chamber, their confidence visible in their relaxed postures and casual conversations. This meeting was a formality, a bureaucratic requirement before launching another successful campaign. Commander Talvik stepped forward to present the intelligence briefing, and his voice carried the assured tone of someone who had analyzed dozens of potential targets before. The humans who lived on Earth, he explained, were hopelessly divided among themselves. Their planet was carved up into nearly 200 different nations, each with its own government, military, and often competing interests. The commander brought up images showing human cities, military installations, and what passed for their space program. Everything about them screamed primitive by galactic standards. The humans still used chemical rockets to escape their own gravity well, burning refined petroleum products just to reach their own moon. Their weapons technology relied almost entirely on nuclear fission, the same power source that most civilized species had abandoned thousands of years ago in favor of cleaner and more efficient energy systems. Commander Talvik highlighted several intercepted transmissions that showed human nations threatening each other, building weapons designed to fight other humans rather than defending against external threats. The commander's analysis was clear and damning. Earth spent more time and resources preparing to fight itself than it did looking outward to the stars. The tactical assessment painted an even bleaker picture for humanity. Commander Talvik estimated that a standard pacification fleet would be more than sufficient to handle Earth's defenses. Based on observed military capabilities, the entire operation from first contact to complete surrender should take no more than 3 standard cycles, which translated to roughly 3 weeks in human time measurement. The Jarthic had conquered far more advanced civilizations in similar timeframes. Several council members nodded in agreement, already mentally moving on to other matters that required their attention. Then Science Officer Mexrin spoke up, and the mood in the chamber shifted slightly. The science officer was known for being thorough and cautious, sometimes annoyingly so, but his track record of accurate assessments had earned him respect among the military leadership. Mexrin pointed out an anomaly in their data that troubled him deeply. Over the past 20 rotations, which equaled roughly 15 human years, the Confederation had sent 3 separate reconnaissance missions into the Sol system to gather intelligence on Earth and its neighboring planets. None of those missions had ever returned. The chamber fell quiet as Mexrin displayed the mission logs on the holographic screen. The first reconnaissance vessel had entered the Sol system and transmitted preliminary data for approximately 6 days before all contact ceased. No distress signal had been sent, no emergency beacon activated, and no debris field had been located despite follow-up scans of the region. The second mission, sent 4 rotations later with more advanced communication equipment, had suffered the same fate. It transmitted normally for 8 days, sending back detailed observations of human civilization, and then simply vanished without explanation. The third and most recent mission had disappeared even faster, going silent after only 3 days in the system. Science Officer Mexrin suggested several possibilities for these disappearances, and none of them were comforting. Perhaps Earth possessed defensive capabilities that their long-range scans had failed to detect. Perhaps the Sol system contained environmental hazards or spatial anomalies that interfered with ship systems in ways they didn't yet understand. Perhaps, and this was the most troubling possibility, the humans had somehow detected, intercepted, and captured all 3 reconnaissance missions without the Confederation ever knowing. The science officer recommended delaying the invasion until they could send a larger, better-equipped reconnaissance force to investigate these disappearances. Admiral Vector listened to these concerns with growing impatience. The Admiral had served in the Confederation military for over 60 rotations and had personally overseen the conquest of 18 different worlds. He had heard similar worried predictions before nearly every campaign, and they had always proven to be unnecessary anxiety. The Admiral raised his primary appendage in a dismissive gesture that everyone in the chamber understood. Those reconnaissance vessels, he explained with barely concealed irritation, were old models from the previous generation of scout ship design. They were known to have issues with their navigation systems, especially when operating near dense asteroid fields. The Admiral pulled up a star chart of the Sol system and highlighted the asteroid belt that orbited between the fourth and fifth planets. This region contained millions of rocky fragments ranging from dust particles to mountain-sized boulders, all tumbling through space in unpredictable patterns. The old reconnaissance ships with their outdated sensors and slower reaction times could easily have suffered catastrophic collisions in such an environment. The fact that all three had disappeared in the same general region of space actually supported this explanation rather than suggesting anything mysterious about Earth itself. It was simple equipment failure, nothing more. The Supreme Council debated the issue for less than 10 minutes before calling for a vote. The result was unanimous in favor of proceeding with the invasion. They authorized Admiral Vector to assemble a standard pacification fleet consisting of 200 warships, the same force composition that had successfully conquered the last dozen worlds without significant resistance. The meeting adjourned with handshakes and congratulations all around, and the council members departed to attend to other business. None of them gave Earth another thought as they left the chamber. Why would they? It was just another primitive world that would soon join the Confederation, willingly or otherwise. Over the following days, the massive invasion fleet assembled at the edge of Confederation space. 200 warships gathered in formation, each one bristling with weapons capable of reducing continents to ash. Support vessels carrying ground troops, occupation equipment, and colonization supplies joined the armada. Admiral Vector stood on the bridge of his flagship, a massive dreadnought that had served as his command vessel for the past 20 rotations. He watched through the observation ports as the final ships arrived and took their positions in the fleet formation. The Admiral felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and confidence that always preceded a new conquest. In 3 days, the fleet would activate their faster-than-light drives and cross the vast distance between Confederation space and the Sol system in a matter of hours. They would emerge at the edge of Earth's solar system, far enough out to observe but close enough to make their presence undeniably clear. Then they would broadcast their surrender demands in every human language, giving Earth's governments a chance to capitulate peacefully before the inevitable military action began. Admiral Vector had never seen those demands refused in his entire military career. Every species eventually recognized the futility of resisting the Confederation's overwhelming military superiority. Some surrendered immediately, grateful to avoid bloodshed. Others resisted briefly before accepting the inevitable. A few had fought desperately for weeks or even months, but they all eventually surrendered. Earth would be no different. The Admiral was certain of that. The order to depart was given, and the massive fleet began its journey into faster-than-light space. The ships vanished from normal space in flashes of light, beginning their voyage toward Earth. The Jathic Confederation was heading to make first contact with humanity, confident in their military might and certain of their victory. None of them knew that they were sailing directly into a trap that had been prepared for years, or that they were about to encounter a species that would shatter every assumption they held about warfare, survival, and the nature of sentient life itself. The Jathic fleet disappeared into the depths of space, carrying with it 4 centuries of unbroken conquest and the arrogance that comes from never having truly been challenged. Earth waited ahead in the darkness, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Jathic fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel exactly where Admiral Vector had planned, at the outer edge of Earth's solar system near the orbit of the 8th planet. The transition from FTL space back to normal space always created a brief moment of disorientation, but the Admiral's crew was experienced and professional. Within minutes, all 200 warships had successfully materialized and were beginning their carefully choreographed formation. The Admiral had designed this formation specifically for psychological impact, arranging his vessels in a pattern that would be clearly visible to any telescopes the humans might have pointed toward the outer solar system. The formation resembled a massive sphere of military might, with the largest dreadnoughts positioned at key points and smaller cruisers and destroyers filling the spaces between them. Each ship's running lights were activated at full brightness, creating a display that would show up on even primitive optical sensors. This was all part of the standard Jathic invasion protocol, refined over centuries of successful conquests. The visual impact of 200 warships appearing suddenly in a star system had a devastating effect on primitive civilizations. It made resistance seem hopeless before a single shot was even fired. The communications officer, a veteran named Dreltork who had participated in 43 previous conquest operations, began broadcasting the surrender demands toward Earth. The message was transmitted on multiple frequencies and in multiple formats to ensure the humans would receive it regardless of their communication technology level. The Jathic translation computers had been analyzing human broadcasts for years through the data collected by those ill-fated reconnaissance missions, and the linguists assured Admiral Vector that they could communicate in the major human languages with reasonable accuracy. The surrender demand was straightforward and had been used successfully hundreds of times before. The message identified the Jathic Confederation as the dominant military power in this region of the galaxy and informed Earth that their planet had been selected for incorporation into the Confederation. The humans were given 48 hours to respond with unconditional surrender, after which military action would commence. The message promised fair treatment and preservation of human culture in exchange for cooperation, while making it clear that resistance would result in significant casualties and destruction. It was a standard formula that balanced threat with incentive, designed to encourage quick capitulation. Admiral Vector settled into his command chair and waited for the inevitable response. In his experience, there were usually three types of initial reactions from newly contacted species. Some immediately surrendered, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation. Others requested negotiations and time to discuss terms, which always eventually led to surrender anyway. A rare few responded with defiant messages that quickly turned to pleas for mercy once military action actually began. The Admiral expected Earth would fall into the second category, requesting time to gather their various governments together to discuss the situation. The first responses from Earth began arriving within a few hours, and almost immediately, Communications Officer Drelltalk began displaying signs of confusion. The responses were coming from multiple sources across Earth's surface, which was expected given their fractured political situation, but the content of these messages was completely unlike anything the Jathic had encountered before. Drelltalk played several of the transmissions for the Admiral and the command staff, and the confusion quickly spread through the entire bridge crew. Some of the human governments were indeed attempting to open diplomatic channels, sending formal messages requesting additional time to convene an emergency session of something they called the United Nations. These messages were polite and professional, exactly what the Jathic expected. However, other responses were coming from different human nations that seemed to have completely different attitudes about the situation. Several governments had immediately issued formal declarations of war against the Jathic Confederation, their messages filled with historical references that the translators struggled to interpret. These humans spoke about past conflicts, about wars they had fought against overwhelming odds, about their refusal to surrender their freedom to any invader regardless of the cost. What truly bewildered the Jathic command staff were the other types of transmissions flooding in from Earth. Some appeared to be entertainment broadcasts, as if certain humans thought the invasion fleet was some kind of elaborate joke or publicity stunt. Other messages seemed designed purely to insult Admiral Vector personally, with creative descriptions of his supposed ancestry and anatomical features that the translators struggled to make sense of. The translation computers kept flagging certain phrases as potentially erroneous because they seemed too absurd to be intentional communications. Commander Talvik reviewed the incoming transmissions with growing concern. The sheer variety of responses suggested that Earth's governments had no unified command structure and possibly no way to quickly coordinate a single response to the invasion. This should have been good news for the Jathic, as divided enemies were easier to conquer, but something about the human responses troubled the commander. Even the defiant messages showed no trace of fear, no sense that the humans truly understood the danger they were facing. It was as if they either didn't believe the Jathic were real or simply didn't care about the overwhelming military superiority arrayed against them. Admiral Vector decided to follow the standard protocol for dealing with confused or defiant species. He would provide a demonstration of Jathic military capability, a measured show of force that would make the reality of the situation undeniably clear. The Admiral ordered his weapons officer to identify and destroy a human military satellite in Earth orbit, something significant enough to prove their weapons were real but not so destructive as to harm civilians on the surface. The targeting officer quickly located an appropriate target, a military communications satellite that appeared to be relaying data between human military installations. The weapons officer aligned the flagship's main energy weapon array with the target satellite and fired a single pulse. The beam crossed the distance between the fleet and Earth orbit in less than a second, striking the satellite with perfect accuracy. The small military satellite exploded in a brief flash of light and debris, its destruction clearly visible to anyone watching from Earth's surface or orbit. Admiral Vector sat back in his command chair and waited for the panic and surrender offers that always followed such demonstrations. Every species eventually understood that resistance was futile once they saw Jathic weapons in action. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed by Jathic military scholars for generations to come, studied as the moment when 4 centuries of successful conquest doctrine encountered something it had never prepared for. The response from Earth was not fear or surrender or even requests for mercy. Instead, within seconds of the satellite's destruction, alarm klaxons began blaring throughout the Jathic fleet as the sensor officers detected massive energy signatures launching from Earth's surface. Nuclear missiles were rising from multiple continents simultaneously, dozens of them climbing out of Earth's atmosphere on pillars of flame. The launches were coordinated across different nations and regions, suggesting some kind of pre-planned response that had been triggered the moment the Jathic opened fire. Commander Talvik's voice rose in pitch as he called out reports of additional threats. Space-based weapon platforms that had somehow escaped detection during the reconnaissance phase were powering up all around Earth orbit. These weren't the primitive satellites the Jathic had observed in their intelligence data, but concealed military weapons that had been hidden among what appeared to be civilian space infrastructure. The Jathic point defense systems activated automatically, tracking and engaging the incoming nuclear warheads with precision laser fire. The primitive missiles were relatively easy to intercept, their flight paths predictable and their speeds manageable even by Jathic standards. One by one, the nuclear warheads were destroyed safely away from the fleet, their detonations creating brief flashes of light against the darkness of space. The kinetic projectiles from the orbital platforms were more challenging, traveling at higher velocities and requiring more complex targeting solutions, but the Jathic defensive systems handled them as well. Admiral Vector should have felt relieved that his fleet had easily defeated Earth's counterattack, but instead he felt a growing sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. Something was fundamentally wrong with how the humans had responded. In 4 centuries of conquest, no species had ever responded to a demonstration of force with immediate military escalation. Every other civilization had used that moment to open negotiations or plead for mercy or at least hesitate while they considered their options. The humans had responded to the destruction of a single satellite by immediately launching everything they had, as if they had been waiting for an excuse to start fighting. Commander Talvik brought up intercepted human military communications on the main display, and what the Jathic command staff heard made the situation even more confusing. The human military forces were coordinating their response across previously hostile national boundaries with shocking efficiency. Nations that the intelligence reports had identified as enemies or rivals were now sharing targeting data, tactical information, and resource allocations as if they had been training together for years. Within 30 minutes of the satellite's destruction, what had been dozens of independent and often competing military organizations had unified into what they were calling the Unified Earth Defense Force. The speed of this unification violated every prediction the Jathic tactical computers had made about human behavior. The models had suggested it would take weeks or even months for Earth's fractured governments to coordinate any kind of unified response, if they could manage it at all. Instead, the humans had achieved complete military integration in less time than it took the Jathic fleet to recharge their weapons systems after the satellite strike. Something was very wrong with the intelligence data the Confederation had been working from. Science Officer Mexrin approached the Admiral with a preliminary analysis that made the situation even more concerning. The science officer had been reviewing the intercepted human communications more carefully and had made a disturbing discovery. The humans had been preparing for this exact scenario, not for weeks or months, but for decades. Their entertainment media was filled with stories about alien invasions, their military forces had conducted exercises simulating defense against extraterrestrial attack, and their weapons development programs had apparently included contingency plans for fighting enemies with superior technology. The humans hadn't been surprised by the Jathic arrival because they had been expecting something like this for generations. Admiral Vector stared at the tactical display showing Earth and the dispersing clouds of destroyed missiles and felt the first real doubt of his military career. The humans weren't responding like victims or even like desperate defenders. They were responding like a military force that had been waiting for this fight and was almost eager to begin it. The Admiral realized with growing dread that the Jathic Confederation might have made a terrible mistake in targeting Earth, but pride and duty required that he continue with the invasion. The fleet had come too far to turn back now based on nothing more than an unsettling feeling. The ground invasion would proceed as planned, and Admiral Vector tried to convince himself that everything would go according to protocol once his forces actually landed on Earth's surface. Admiral Vector stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring at the communication console as the first reports from the ground invasion began arriving. The landing operations had been executed flawlessly according to plan. 5 separate landing zones had been established in major population centers across Earth's surface, each one deploying roughly 2,000 Jathic ground troops with full combat support. The landings themselves had gone smoothly, with the drop ships touching down in carefully selected positions that provided tactical advantages and clear fields of fire. Everything had proceeded exactly as it should have during the initial deployment phase. Then the fighting actually started, and within the first 6 hours, Admiral Vector knew with absolute certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. The reports coming back from landing site Alpha, positioned in a massive human city called New York, described a nightmare scenario that shouldn't have been possible. The landing force commander, a decorated veteran named Krovex who had successfully led ground operations on 15 previous conquests, was sending increasingly frantic messages that described casualties at levels the Admiral had never seen before in his entire military career. Landing Force Alpha had suffered 90% casualties in just 6 hours of combat. 90%. Admiral Vector read the number 3 times because his mind refused to accept it as accurate. The tactical doctrine suggested that any military force suffering more than 30% casualties would break and retreat, that 50% casualties represented complete operational collapse. Yet somehow the humans had inflicted casualties 3 times that threshold in a time frame that should have been insufficient for serious combat operations. The Admiral demanded video recordings from the battlefield, needing to see with his own eyes what could possibly have caused such devastating losses. Commander Talvik loaded the battlefield recordings onto the main display, and the entire bridge crew watched in stunned silence as the true nature of humanity revealed itself. The footage showed Jathic soldiers in their standard combat armor advancing through the streets of New York with professional precision. The armor was powered exoskeleton technology that enhanced strength and provided protection against most conventional weapons. Each soldier carried energy weapons capable of punching through reinforced concrete. By every reasonable military calculation, these soldiers should have been unstoppable against a pre-spaceflight civilization armed with primitive gunpowder weapons. The recordings showed what actually happened when superior technology met an enemy that simply refused to acknowledge they were supposed to lose. Human soldiers engaged the Jathic forces with a level of aggression that the tactical computers literally could not model. The Jathic doctrine assumed that soldiers would seek cover when under fire, would retreat when taking casualties, would behave in rational self-preserving ways during combat. The humans did none of these things. They advanced directly into Jathic fire, accepting casualties that should have broken any military formation, and kept coming with relentless determination. One particular video clip captured the attention of everyone on the bridge. A Jathic soldier had established a defensive position at an intersection, using an overturned vehicle for cover while engaging human forces advancing down the street. The soldier's energy weapon was functioning perfectly, dropping human attackers with precise shots. Then a human soldier, identified from intercepted communications as someone named Jake Morrison, was hit by energy fire that should have killed him instantly. The shot burned through his combat vest and clearly caused severe internal injuries. What happened next was analyzed frame by frame because none of the Jathic observers could initially believe what they were seeing. Jake Morrison didn't fall down. He didn't retreat or call for medical assistance. Instead, he continued his advance toward the Jathic position, moving with visible pain but undiminished determination. When his rifle jammed or ran out of ammunition, the human soldier picked up a piece of broken metal rebar from the destroyed street and closed the distance to the Jathic warrior. The powered armor should have made the Jathic soldier invulnerable to such a primitive weapon, but Jake Morrison used the metal bar to pry open a joint in the armor plating and disabled the power system. Other human soldiers immediately overwhelmed the position. The tactical computer flagged this incident as a probable data error because it violated known biological limits for species survival with that level of injury. Commander Talvik ran diagnostic checks on the recording equipment and confirmed that the video was authentic and unaltered. The humans were somehow continuing to fight with injuries that should have caused immediate incapacitation in any species the Jathic had previously encountered. This wasn't just courage or determination, this was something fundamentally different about human physiology and psychology that the Confederation's intelligence had completely failed to identify. The situation at Landing Site Bravo, established in a human city called Moscow, presented different but equally troubling problems for the Jathic invasion force. The landing there had actually proceeded without immediate opposition, which the landing commander had interpreted as a positive sign. The Jathic forces had established their perimeter, set up defensive positions, and begun the process of securing the surrounding area. Then the trap closed around them with brutal efficiency. The humans had deliberately allowed the Jathic to land unopposed, using that initial period to completely encircle the landing zone with forces positioned in buildings, underground metro tunnels, and even the city's sewer system. The Jathic suddenly found themselves fighting in 3 dimensions simultaneously, attacked from above by human soldiers positioned in high-rise buildings, from ground level by armored vehicles and infantry, and from below by forces emerging from the underground infrastructure that riddled the city. A human officer named Colonel David Peterson had coordinated this entire defensive operation, and his tactical approach combined principles from ancient siege warfare with modern weapons and communications. The Jathic forces at landing site Bravo possessed superior firepower and better armor, but those advantages meant almost nothing in the urban combat environment the humans had created. Every street became a kill zone where Jathic forces were channeled into prepared ambush positions. Every building potentially contained human snipers or anti-armor teams. The underground tunnels allowed human forces to move unseen beneath Jathic positions and attack from unexpected directions. The landing force commander requested orbital fire support to simply level the entire area, but Admiral Vector denied the request because it would have caused massive civilian casualties and violated Confederation rules of engagement. Science Officer Mexrin had been analyzing all the combat data from the various landing sites, and the officer approached Admiral Vector with a comprehensive report that explained why the humans were performing so far beyond predicted capabilities. The science officer's analysis started with basic biology and worked up to the psychological factors that made humanity such a dangerous opponent. Earth, Mexrin explained, was what galactic xenobiologists would classify as a Class 4 death world, a planet with environmental conditions that produced extraordinarily resilient life forms. The gravity on Earth's surface was approximately 40% higher than the galactic average for inhabited worlds. This meant that humans had evolved with denser bone structure, more powerful musculature, and cardiovascular systems designed to pump blood against significantly higher gravitational resistance. A human soldier could carry equipment loads and maintain activity levels that would exhaust soldiers from lower gravity species. The humans could quite literally outlast Jathic forces in sustained combat because their bodies were built for endurance in ways that the Confederation's military planners had never encountered before. The science officer continued with even more troubling revelations about human evolution. Humans had evolved as persistence hunters, a relatively rare hunting strategy where predators chase prey over long distances until the prey animal collapses from exhaustion. This evolutionary history had given humans extraordinary stamina and pain tolerance. Where Jathic soldiers needed regular rest periods and would become combat ineffective after extended periods of high stress, humans could maintain combat operations for days with minimal rest. Their bodies produced chemical compounds that allowed them to temporarily ignore pain and injuries that would disable other species. The psychological analysis was perhaps the most disturbing part of Science Officer Mexrin's report. Humans possessed what the officer called pack bonding behavior, an intensely social trait where they formed extremely strong emotional connections to their group members. When humans fought as part of a unit, they weren't just following orders or fighting for abstract concepts like territory or resources. They were fighting to protect the specific individuals they had bonded with, and this created a force multiplier effect that the Jathic tactical models had no way to account for. Humans would accept their own death to protect their pack members, would fight with enhanced effectiveness when defending comrades, and would seek revenge with terrifying dedication when pack members were harmed. Admiral Vector listened to this analysis and felt his confidence in the invasion's success crumbling with every word. The Jathic Confederation had built their military doctrine around fighting rational opponents who valued their own survival and would surrender when the cost of continued resistance exceeded potential benefits. Humans apparently didn't operate according to those rational calculations. They were fighting each other, protecting each other, and treating the entire conflict as something personal rather than political. The Admiral realized they weren't fighting an army in the traditional sense, they were fighting an entire species that had evolved to survive against impossible odds and simply didn't know how to quit. The ground invasion was failing catastrophically, and Admiral Vector had no idea how to reverse the situation. The second week of the invasion brought a shift in the conflict that Admiral Vector would remember for the rest of his life, assuming he survived long enough to have a rest of his life. The ground forces were trapped in deteriorating positions across Earth's surface, taking casualties faster than replacements could be deployed even if replacements had been available. The Admiral made the decision that had always worked in previous campaigns when ground operations stalled. He would use the fleet's orbital bombardment capability to destroy key human military installations, breaking the back of organized resistance and giving his ground troops the breathing room they needed to regroup and advance. The targeting officers identified several high-value targets for the orbital strikes. Major military command centers, weapons production facilities, and communications hubs were marked for destruction. The plan was to demonstrate the full power of the Jathic fleet, to show the humans that continued resistance would only result in the complete destruction of their military infrastructure. Admiral Vector authorized the attack, and the weapons officers began powering up the main energy cannons on 3 of the fleet's heavy cruisers. The charging process took several minutes as massive amounts of energy were routed to the weapon systems, and the entire fleet watched their tactical displays as the weapons reached firing readiness. The moment the first Jathic ship's weapons reached full power and began the firing sequence, Earth responded with a counterattack that had clearly been planned and prepared for exactly this moment. Launch signatures bloomed across the tactical displays like deadly flowers, appearing from locations scattered across multiple continents and from positions in Earth's orbital space. Nuclear missiles were climbing out of the atmosphere again, but this time there were far more of them and they were being deployed in coordination with other weapon systems that the Jathic hadn't even known existed. The sheer volume of incoming threats overwhelmed the Jathic point defense systems within seconds. The defensive computers could track and engage a certain number of targets simultaneously, but the humans had launched enough weapons to exceed that capacity by a significant margin. Nuclear warheads detonated against shield systems that had been designed to handle one or two such impacts, not dozens arriving almost simultaneously. The electromagnetic pulses from the nuclear detonations interfered with Jathic sensors and targeting systems, creating blind spots that the humans immediately exploited with follow-up attacks. More sophisticated weapons that had never appeared in any of the reconnaissance data suddenly activated from hidden positions throughout Earth's orbital space. What the Jathic had identified as commercial communication satellites suddenly revealed themselves to be disguised weapon platforms, their outer casing splitting open to expose military-grade directed energy weapons and missile batteries. Kinetic bombardment systems that had been concealed among the clouds of space debris orbiting Earth began launching projectiles, simple chunks of dense metal accelerated to tremendous velocities that hit Jathic ships with devastating kinetic energy. Commander Talvik's voice rose to a pitch that Admiral Vektar had never heard from the usually calm officer as reports of damage flooded into the bridge from across the fleet. The flagship itself shuddered as multiple impacts struck the shields, the defensive systems groaning under loads they had never been designed to handle. 3 Jathic destroyers reported critical damage to their propulsion systems. A heavy cruiser that had been preparing to fire on Earth's surface took a direct hit from what appeared to be a modified civilian spacecraft that had deliberately rammed the warship at high velocity. The suicide attack was piloted by a human named Captain Robert Hayes according to the intercepted communications that the Jathic picked up in the moments before impact. The captain had been flying a modified cargo shuttle that had been loaded with high explosives and accelerated to maximum velocity on a collision course with the cruiser. The Jathic point defense systems had been focused on the nuclear missiles and had failed to identify the shuttle as a priority threat until it was too late to intercept. The shuttle struck the cruiser's engine section and detonated, the combined kinetic impact and explosion tearing through the ship's armor and setting off secondary explosions in the power systems. The cruiser didn't explode dramatically like ships did in human entertainment media, but the damage was catastrophic nonetheless. The vessel went dead in space, all power systems offline and life support failing. The explosion created a massive debris field that spread outward from the impact point, and 3 nearby Jathic ships took damage from fragments of the destroyed cruiser traveling at high velocity. Admiral Vektar watched in horror as a single human pilot in a civilian spacecraft had effectively eliminated 4 of his warships through one desperate action. The tactical implications were staggering. If humans were willing to use suicide tactics with military effectiveness, the entire calculus of the space battle shifted in ways the Jathic had no doctrine to address. Science Officer Mexrin interrupted the chaos with a discovery that explained how the invasion had gone so catastrophically wrong from the very beginning. The science officer had been analyzing the reconnaissance data that the Confederation had collected on Earth over the past 15 years, comparing it against what they were actually encountering during the invasion. The discrepancies were enormous and systematic, far too consistent to be explained by simple intelligence-gathering errors. The humans had been deliberately manipulating the data that Jathic reconnaissance missions collected, feeding false information to make Earth appear less defended and less technologically advanced than it actually was. Every scan that the reconnaissance ships had performed had been subtly altered by human electronic warfare systems that the Jathic hadn't even known to look for. When Jathic sensors swept Earth's orbital space, human systems had hidden military satellites and made them appear to be civilian communications equipment. When reconnaissance probes analyzed human military capabilities, carefully crafted false data had been fed into their systems to make human weapons appear more primitive than they were. The entire intelligence picture that had led to the invasion decision had been manufactured by human military planners who had been preparing for this exact scenario. The 3 missing reconnaissance missions suddenly made terrible sense in light of this discovery. Those ships hadn't been lost to navigational errors or equipment failures as Admiral Vektar had assumed. They had been captured by human forces, almost certainly while investigating something in Earth's orbital space that the humans had used as bait. The crews of those reconnaissance vessels had been taken prisoner, and the humans had kept those captures completely secret from their own civilian population while military intelligence officers interrogated the Jathic prisoners for years. Everything the Confederation thought would be a surprise about their technology, tactics, and capabilities, the humans had already known about because they had spent years extracting that information from captured Jathic personnel. The realization hit Admiral Vector like a physical blow. The invasion had been doomed before it even started. The humans had been preparing for Jathic contact for over a decade, had built their entire defensive strategy around intelligence gathered from captured reconnaissance crews, and had deliberately manipulated Confederation intelligence to ensure that when the invasion came, it would come at a time and in a manner that played directly into human defensive plans. The Jathic hadn't invaded Earth. They had walked into a carefully prepared ambush with their eyes closed, confident in their superiority and completely unaware that the humans had been waiting for them. The situation on Earth's surface was deteriorating even faster than the space battle. The human military forces had completely reorganized under a unified command structure that they were calling the Unified Earth Defense Force. What had been dozens of separate national militaries with different languages, doctrines, and command systems had somehow merged into a single coordinated fighting force in less than 2 weeks. General Mark Williams, a human officer from one of the larger nations, had been appointed as the supreme commander and was coordinating defensive operations across the entire planet with remarkable efficiency. Regional commanders were executing operations that combined conventional military tactics with guerrilla warfare principles in ways that were systematically destroying every Jathic ground position. Colonel Patricia Henderson was leading forces in the North American continent that had trapped and eliminated 2 entire Jathic landing battalions through a combination of airstrikes, artillery bombardment, and infantry assaults that gave the aliens no chance to retreat or regroup. Major Vincent Cole was coordinating defensive operations in Europe that used the terrain and urban environments to negate Jathic technological advantages. Captain Rebecca Stone was leading special forces teams in Asia that were conducting raids deep behind Jathic lines, destroying supply depots and command posts with surgical precision. The humans were fighting with a level of coordination and tactical sophistication that suggested decades of preparation and training for exactly this scenario. Admiral Vector reviewed intercepted human communications and discovered something that chilled him to his core. The humans had been preparing for hostile alien contact since the mid-20th century, shortly after they developed nuclear weapons and began serious space exploration. Their entertainment media was filled with invasion scenarios. Their military forces had conducted exercises and war games simulating defense against technologically superior enemies. Their weapons research programs had included contingency plans for fighting opponents with capabilities beyond current human technology. The Jathic had assumed they were making first contact with a primitive species that would be shocked and overwhelmed by the existence of alien life. Instead, they had invaded a world that had been expecting them for generations and had spent that time preparing every possible defensive measure. The humans had studied their own history of warfare, had analyzed every successful defense against invasion throughout their violent past, and had adapted those lessons to the challenge of fighting an enemy from the stars. They had been ready, and the Jathic had been caught completely unprepared for an enemy that refused to follow the script of previous conquests. Admiral Vector stood on his damaged flagship bridge, surrounded by reports of casualties and system failures, and made the hardest decision of his military career. The invasion had failed completely and catastrophically. Continuing the operation would only result in the total destruction of his fleet and the death of every Jathic soldier on Earth's surface. He had no choice but to order a full retreat, to abandon the ground forces that couldn't be evacuated, and to get whatever remained of his fleet away from Earth before the humans destroyed them all. The Admiral's voice was steady as he gave the orders, but inside he felt the weight of 4 centuries of Jathic military pride crumbling under the terrible realization that they had finally encountered an enemy they simply could not defeat. Admiral Vector stood on the bridge of his battered flagship and spoke the words that no Jathic commander had uttered in over 400 years of military conquest. He ordered a complete withdrawal from the Sol system, a full retreat that meant abandoning the ground forces still trapped on Earth's surface and fleeing with whatever remained of his once mighty fleet. The navigation officer immediately began calculating faster-than-light jump coordinates that would take them away from Earth and back toward Confederation space, working with urgent efficiency because every minute they remained in the system increased the likelihood that none of them would escape alive. The tactical displays showed the true scope of the catastrophe as the retreat order rippled through what remained of the fleet. Ships began attempting to activate their faster-than-light drives to escape Earth's gravity well, but something was preventing the majority of them from making the jump to FTL space. The navigation systems were functioning correctly, the drive showed full power, but the actual transition to faster-than-light travel simply wouldn't engage. Commander Talvik worked desperately to diagnose the problem while Admiral Vector watched the tactical display with growing horror as he realized what was happening. The humans had somehow deployed an interdiction field around Earth that prevented faster-than-light travel within a certain radius of the planet. This technology shouldn't have existed in the human arsenal according to every intelligence assessment the Confederation had made. Faster-than-light interdiction required sophisticated understanding of spatial mechanics and tremendous amounts of power to generate a field large enough to trap military vessels. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Nearly 70% of the surviving Jathic fleet found themselves unable to escape, their ships trapped in normal space by human technology that was supposedly beyond their capability to develop or deploy. Science Officer Mexrin analyzed the interdiction field and made a discovery that explained how the humans had achieved this impossible feat. They had reverse-engineered the technology from the 3 captured reconnaissance vessels, studying the Jathic faster-than-light drives for years until they understood the underlying principles well enough to develop countermeasures. The humans hadn't invented interdiction technology from scratch in a matter of weeks. They had been working on it for over a decade, preparing this trap for the invasion they knew would eventually come. Every piece of the human defensive strategy had been built on knowledge extracted from those captured Jathic crews through years of patient interrogation and study. Commander Talvik coordinated a fighting retreat toward the outer edges of the Sol system where sensor readings suggested the interdiction effect grew weaker with distance from Earth. The ships that couldn't jump to faster-than-light speed would have to travel through normal space until they reached a point where their drives could activate. This meant a running battle through the solar system with human forces in pursuit and time working against the fleeing Jathic vessels. The commander organized the retreat with professional skill, positioning the most damaged ships as a rear guard to absorb human attacks while vessels with better chances of survival moved ahead toward potential escape. The human pursuit came fast and relentless, and what the Jathic saw pursuing them added another layer of horror to the disaster. The humans were flying Jathic scout ships, vessels that had clearly been captured during the early days of the invasion and somehow made operational with human crews in an impossibly short time frame. These weren't crude attempts to pilot alien technology. The humans were operating the captured vessels with skill that suggested complete understanding of Jathic ship systems, maneuvering with precision and using the weapons with deadly effectiveness. A human pilot leading the pursuit squadron was identified through intercepted communications as Captain Lisa Bennett, and she flew the captured Jathic scout ship like she had been training on it for years rather than days. Her squadron destroyed 3 Jathic destroyers that had been designated as rear guard, targeting their engines with precision strikes that left the vessels dead in space. Admiral Vector watched the tactical displays and realized with chilling clarity that the humans were deliberately letting some Jathic ships escape. They were culling the fleet, destroying enough vessels to demonstrate their capability while allowing survivors to flee and carry the message of this defeat back to the Confederation. The pursuit finally broke off at the edge of the solar system near the orbit of the outermost planets, where the interdiction field effect had weakened enough that Jathic faster-than-light drives could finally activate. Captain Bennett's squadron fired a final volley that destroyed 2 more damaged Jathic vessels, then turned back toward Earth rather than pursuing further into deep space. The message was unmistakable in its implications. The humans could have destroyed more of the fleet if they had wanted to, but they were making a deliberate choice to let survivors escape. They wanted the Jathic Confederation to know exactly what had happened at Earth, wanted the story of this defeat to spread throughout the galaxy as a warning to anyone else who might consider humanity an easy target. Science Officer Mexrin had been analyzing the captured Jathic technology that the humans had turned against them, and the officer's report painted a picture that Admiral Vector found almost more terrifying than the military defeat itself. A human engineer named Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Cooper had apparently led the effort to understand and operate Jathic faster-than-light drives, and he hadn't just figured out how to make them work. The human engineer had identified inefficiencies in the Jathic design and implemented modifications that actually improved the drive's performance beyond their original specifications. The implications of this discovery were staggering in ways that went far beyond the immediate military situation. Humanity had gone from being a pre-faster-than-light civilization to successfully operating and even improving captured alien starship technology in less than 3 weeks. This kind of rapid technological adaptation should have been impossible. Most species required generations of study and development to achieve such advances. The Jathic themselves had taken centuries to develop their faster-than-light capability from theoretical understanding to practical implementation. Yet somehow the humans had compressed that entire learning curve into a time frame measured in days. Admiral Vector's flagship managed to escape the Sol system along with only 42 other vessels out of the 200 warships that had entered with such confidence just 2 weeks earlier. Less than a quarter of the invasion fleet had survived, and many of those survivors were damaged vessels limping back to Confederation space with wounded crews and shattered morale. As the ships made the jump to faster-than-light travel and began the long journey home, Admiral Vector received one final transmission from Earth that he knew would haunt him for whatever remained of his life and career. The transmission showed a human military officer named General Mark Williams standing in what appeared to be a captured Jathic command center. The general was flanked by other human commanders representing different nations and military branches, all standing in front of a captured Jathic battle standard that had been taken as a war trophy. The general spoke in perfect Jathic trade language, the translation clearly provided by interrogated prisoners who had taught humans the nuances of Confederation speech. The message was formal and carefully worded, obviously crafted for maximum political and psychological impact. General Williams declared that Earth was under human protection and that any future acts of aggression against humanity or their home world would be met with overwhelming force. He stated that humanity was now aware of the wider galactic community and would be joining that community on their own terms in the very near future. The general made it clear that humans considered the Jathic invasion an act of war and that Earth reserved the right to respond to that aggression in whatever manner they deemed appropriate. The transmission ended with a final statement that sent chills through every Jathic officer who heard it. The general thanked Admiral Vector for the generous gift of advanced technology and stated that humanity looked forward to putting those gifts to good use in the coming years. The journey back to Confederation space took weeks of travel through faster-than-light space, and the surviving crew members used that time to compile comprehensive reports on everything that had gone wrong during the invasion. Every department and specialty prepared detailed analyses of their experiences fighting humanity, and the picture that emerged from these reports was consistent and deeply troubling. The Jathic had encountered a species that operated according to rules completely different from anything in their previous experience of warfare and conquest. Dr. Renthal, the chief medical officer, documented the psychological impact of combat against a species that appeared to have no surrender instinct and no rational calculation of acceptable casualties. Jathic soldiers had been trained to fight according to doctrines that assumed enemies would behave predictably when faced with overwhelming force. The humans had violated every one of those assumptions, fighting with ferocity and determination that caused unprecedented levels of combat stress among Jathic troops. Many of the surviving soldiers were experiencing what human military terminology called post-traumatic stress, psychological injuries from combat experiences that exceeded their ability to process and cope with the violence they had witnessed. Commander Talvik prepared tactical analyses of every major engagement during the invasion, identifying the lessons learned from fighting an enemy that adapted and evolved their tactics at speeds that seemed biologically impossible. The humans had demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for rapid learning, taking lessons from each encounter and immediately applying those lessons in subsequent battles. Tactical approaches that worked against humans in the morning would be countered by new defensive measures by afternoon. The speed of this adaptation suggested that humanity possessed some kind of collective learning ability that allowed them to share tactical knowledge across their entire military structure almost instantly. Science Officer Mexrin compiled the most comprehensive and frightening assessment of all, analyzing human technological capability and extrapolating what humanity might become once they developed their own faster-than-light technology rather than relying on captured Jathic vessels. The science officer's projections suggested that humanity would achieve independent FTL capability within a decade at most, possibly within just a few years given their demonstrated ability to reverse engineer and improve captured technology. Once humans reached the stars with their own ships, they would expand outward with the same relentless determination they had shown in defending their home world. Every report compiled during the journey reached essentially the same conclusion through different analytical frameworks. The Jathic Confederation had made first contact with a species far more dangerous than their current technology level suggested. Humanity's threat level came not from their existing weapons or ships, but from their psychology, their adaptability, and their absolute refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances. These were traits that couldn't be countered through superior technology or overwhelming force. The humans would keep fighting, keep learning, and keep adapting until they either won or everyone involved was dead. There was no middle ground in the human approach to existential conflict. The fleet finally emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Confederation space and began the final approach to the Supreme Council's home world. Admiral Vector knew that his military career was effectively over regardless of how the Council judged his actions during the invasion. He had lost over 75% of his fleet, had failed to achieve any strategic objectives, and was returning home with a warning about a new threat that the Confederation was completely unprepared to handle. The Admiral spent the final days of the journey preparing his presentation to the Council, organizing all the reports and data into a comprehensive briefing that would hopefully convince the Council members of the seriousness of the situation. The Supreme Council convened in the same chamber where they had authorized the invasion with such casual confidence just weeks earlier. The mood was dramatically different now as Admiral Vector stood before them and delivered his report on the failed Earth campaign. The council members listened in complete silence as the Admiral described every aspect of the nightmare his fleet had encountered. He explained human evolution on a high-gravity death world, their persistence hunting biology that gave them extraordinary endurance and pain tolerance, and their pack-bonding psychology that made them fight with enhanced effectiveness when defending each other. Admiral Vector detailed how humanity had captured the 3 reconnaissance missions years ago and had spent that entire time preparing for the invasion they knew would eventually come. He showed the council recordings of human soldiers fighting with injuries that should have been fatal, of human pilots conducting suicide attacks against Jathic vessels, of human engineers reverse engineering captured technology at impossible speeds. The Admiral presented Science Officer Mexrin's projections showing that humanity would likely achieve faster-than-light capability within years and would begin expanding into the galaxy as a spacefaring civilization with all the determination and adaptability they had demonstrated in defending their home world. The political implications of the failed invasion spread rapidly through the Confederation and beyond into the wider galactic community. Species that had been conquered and absorbed into the Jathic Empire began quietly making inquiries about human defensive tactics and weapons technology. Independent civilizations that had previously avoided Confederation attention suddenly found themselves extremely interested in establishing diplomatic relations with Earth. The Jathic military doctrine that had served successfully for 4 centuries was fundamentally challenged and called into question. If humanity could defeat a standard Confederation pacification fleet, what did that say about the security of existing Confederation territories and the viability of future expansion? Admiral Vector concluded his presentation to the Supreme Council with a final piece of information that had arrived just before the fleet reached Confederation space. Earth had broadcast a message to the entire galaxy on multiple frequencies and in multiple formats, ensuring that every spacefaring civilization would receive and understand it. The message contained detailed reports of the Jathic invasion and humanity's successful defense, complete with tactical analyses, weapon specifications, and strategic assessments. More importantly, the message included an introduction to humanity and an invitation for peaceful contact with any civilizations interested in diplomatic and trade relations. The Admiral played the final portion of this galactic broadcast, which featured a human civilian rather than a military officer. Dr. Amanda Richardson identified herself as a historian and anthropologist, and she delivered a message that was clearly intended to explain humanity to the wider galaxy. She described human evolutionary history as a story of survival against impossible odds, of a species that had outlasted ice ages and predators and diseases that should have driven them to extinction. Humans had reached the top of their planet's food chain not through superior strength or speed but through endurance, adaptability, tool use, and most importantly through their absolute refusal to give up in the face of adversity. Dr. Richardson concluded her message with a statement that would be quoted and analyzed by galactic political scientists and military strategists for generations to come. She said simply that the Jathic hadn't invaded Earth but had instead introduced themselves to the species that would inherit the galaxy. Humanity was coming to the stars, and they would bring with them all the determination and adaptability that had carried them through millions of years of evolution on one of the most competitive and dangerous planets in known space. The message wasn't a threat but rather a statement of inevitable fact. Humanity had been preparing for this moment throughout their entire evolutionary history, and now that they knew they weren't alone in the universe, nothing would stop them from taking their place among the stars. Admiral Vector finished his presentation and stood silently before the Supreme Council, waiting for their judgment. The chamber remained quiet for a long moment as the council members processed everything they had heard. The Jathic Confederation had spent 4 centuries as the dominant military power in their region of space, conquering hundreds of worlds through overwhelming technological superiority. Now they faced a future where a new species had emerged, a species that couldn't be intimidated or defeated through conventional means, a species that learned and adapted faster than any civilization in recorded history. The galaxy had changed fundamentally in the span of just 2 weeks, and nobody knew what would come next except that humanity was coming and the universe would never be the same.